welcome to the final session of the day, which will be the first session where we'll have Professor Avishek Parui from IIT Madras. Again, someone who's been associated with IWE Online and the Department of English for several years now, through various lectures, workshops, seminars, and so on. If I may formally introduce Dr. Parui to you. Avishek Parui is Associate Professor in Literature and Memory Studies at IIT Madras and Associate Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He is the author of Postmodern Literatures, published by Orient Black Swan in 2018, and Culture and the Literary Matter, Metaphor, Memory, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2022. He is the faculty coordinator of Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras and chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies, INMS. He was the recipient of the Global Fellowship from the University of St. Andrews in 2023 and the Institute of Advanced Studies Fellowship from Durham University in 2024. With this, may I now invite Dr. Parui, please.
Well, thanks very much, Atul, for a very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back here again in IWE Online. I was part of this project, I think, a couple of years ago when I spoke on Manto and partition. I'm going to do something different today and also tomorrow. I'm afraid I'm going to be an absolute Luddite. I don't have any slides, so it's just a human voice looking at other human beings and speaking. Very, very uninteresting and very uncool, especially compared to this fascinating sessions we had with Professor Mukherjee earlier. But I'll do my best to keep you awake. So what I will do now in this session, and a little bit different tomorrow, is to look at what I call the epistemic entanglements, as in how do different kinds of epistemic structures entangle together, memory studies obviously being one of those epistemic structures, particularly when we read something like Indian writing in English. And of course, as you all know, Indian writing in English is a very complex terrain, because there is this politics of language, politics of representation, there's a sense of hierarchy, the sense of elitism, and who gets to represent more, and all the rest of it. So that itself becomes really, to quote a Bakhtinian term, a very polyphonic terrain. And I think memory studies is uniquely interesting in that dimension because it sort of brings in a lot of things which we consider as dualisms. But actually, what we try to promote is how those become connected categories, in terms of becoming an entanglement, which is why we use the word entanglement in the first place. So I'll start with a slightly funny note, a couple of stories which I may have mentioned earlier. My memory is very weak, especially when I speak on memory. But this is a very familiar story, both cited by Slavoj Žižek. So the first one is overtly political, the second one a little bit less political, but perhaps more complex in some ways. So the first one is set in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this was a very different political system where apparently if you're suspected of even harboring any anti-state sentiment, you'd be sent to a hard labor camp, right? So in such a situation, a man is about to be picked up and is about to be sent to a hard labor camp. Before he's sent off, he decides to sit down to have one final dinner with his mates. And he says, well, they're going to send me off to a labor camp tomorrow. I will write letters to you, but because it's a labor camp, they will intercept all the letters, obviously. They'll read all my letters before they arrive at your end. So let's establish a code, shall we? And what's the code? And the code is, if I write a letter to you in blue ink, assume everything I'm writing is correct, true, right? However, if I'm writing a letter to you in red ink, just invert the logic. In other words, if I'm writing a letter in blue ink saying, I am well, thank you, it means I'm actually well, right? However, if the same letter arrives to you written in red ink, imagine I'm in deep trouble, okay? So he's sent off the following day. A month later, his friends receive a letter from him written in blue ink, which says, I'm actually quite well. The labor camp is not that hard at all. We play football on the weekends. We watch movies sometimes. There's plenty of butter, honey, and jam and bread. I actually don't understand what people complain about so much. We get everything we need to live a good life, except we don't get red ink, right? Second story, more cheesy, but perhaps equally complex. A man walks into a very expensive cafe, one of those very expensive ones. You get plenty of those in Hyderabad. Takes a look at the menu card, one of which says there is this item called coffee without cream, right? So he asks the gentleman who is waiting and says, "Can I have that, please? Coffee without cream." So the gentleman goes to the kitchen, comes back and tells him, "I'm sorry, sir, we can't give you that because we have run out of cream in the kitchen. Would you like black coffee instead?" Right? Now, the point of both the stories, if you obviously, this is a very intelligent audience and you get it right away, is that what is interesting is how absence has become more important than presence, right? What is not there, right? What is missing, the sort of the phantom presence, as it were. Which brings me to the topic of memory as a sort of the shadowy region, the interplay of remembering and forgetting. I'll start with two paradoxes or theorems. I work on IIT, so I use a mathematical vocabulary. Theorem number one, paradox number one, is that when we talk about memory in memory studies, we look at remembering and forgetting not as ontological opposites of each other, but rather instead as cognitively connected categories, even functionally connected categories. In other words, every time you remember something, you must be able to forget something. And notice I'm using the word able, right? So forgetting is an ability. The brain is hardwired to forget, right? We must be able to forget. And I'm not just talking about the extreme cases of trauma where forgetting becomes a coping mechanism. That's easy to understand. But even the quotidian quality of forgetting, even the quotidian dailiness of remembering requires forgetting, right? How so? Let me do this very cheap experiment on you. If I were to ask you, what did you all do on 30th September 2024? You probably say, well, I got up at 7 a.m., had my coffee, took an auto or a car, came to HCU, attended a really boring lecture on memory studies, right? If I were to ask you a month later, what did you do at 30th September 2024? You'd probably just say, I came to HCU, attended something on memory studies. A year later, I came to HCU, right? So what's happening in each of these processes is an incremental erasure, right? In other words, what we call in memory studies is chunking. The brain is chunking away information, right? Now that's easy. Of course, we know that. That happens all the time. But the tricky thing is, even the version you're telling me today, when I'm asking you, what did you do on 30th September 2024? Even that version, trust me, you've already forgotten 70% of stuff you've done, right? I hope none of you remember which hand you used when you went for the coffee mug. I hope none of you remember how many times you moved your hands when you brushed your teeth, or which finger you used when you switched off the light, you turned off the light. None of you remember that. I hope you don't remember, right? Because the brain is supposed to offload this information. That's how it's hardwired to do, right? So there's a lot of offloading the brain is able to do, right? In fact, if that stops at some point, it'll be a disaster. That will begin to affect other cognitive abilities like abstraction, empathy, imagination. All those will get affected in a pretty bad way. There's a really funny story written by Borges, the great Spanish writer Borges. It's called Funes de Memorias. If you just go to Google and write Borges, Funes, F-U-N-E-S, it'll show up. Some translation will show up. So in that story, there's a boy called Funes, a Latin American boy, who falls from a horse, gets hurt in the head. And his disease is he cannot forget anymore. Right? That's a disease, that's a problem. It becomes a pathological situation where he remembers literally everything. Every information, every bit is remembered. And what the story tells us is that begins to compromise his other cognitive abilities. He fails to empathize, he fails to imagine, he fails in abilities of abstraction, and so on and so forth. To the extent that that story is actually cited sometimes today in really interesting research in neuroscience, which tell us, well, if you stop forgetting, this is what happens to you, right? Now, what we do in memory studies is we look at the interface of the macro and the micro model of memory. In other words, memory as a micromolecular mechanism, as it were, how the brain remembers and forgets information, but also equally how cultures, collectives remember and forget information. And is there an interface? Is there any traffic between the two? Is it possible, for instance, to sort of calibrate the way in which a brain remembers and forgets and how cultures remember and forget? Is there any structural similarity, functional similarity, convergences, and so on and so forth? This is where I assert literature kicks in a very big way. Because if you look at literature, the literary medium, as I call it, it is that perfect zone between the brain and the world in some sense, right? Because literature can give you wonderful things like stream of consciousness, interior monologue. It can give you episodic representations of brain, mindfulness, mindlessness, trauma, and all the rest of it. But at the same time, all literary works are also deeply situated in social contexts, social, political, cultural context. And no matter how much you love James Joyce, I do actually, no matter how much you're a fan of the Joyce and Epiphany, we also have to remember this is happening within a very, very Irish Catholic context, right? So the dream of Bloom or the dream of Daedalus is a certain kind of dream because that's human subject is always already situated in a certain religious, ethnic, linguistic context. Of course, a very complex context. Now, that allows us to take a very intersectional look in memory studies in terms of looking at the sort of x-axis, y-axis thing, the x-axis being the sort of vertical look at memory, as it were, the depth reading of memory in terms of memory works in the brain, the interiority of memory, and all the rest of it. And of course, we have the horizontality of memory, memory cutting across space and time, memory cutting across different kinds of complex cultural conditions, social conditions. So memory studies is nothing if not an examination of this interface, an examination of how the brain model and the culture model collide. And I use the word collide not accidentally, but as a tribute to one of my favorite philosophers in cognition, Andy Clark. If you read Andy Clark, the fascinating philosopher really, who works from a cognitive, computational cognitive position really, very hardcore, as it were. But he has this wonderful concept of the situated brain. Now that's interesting because it's a bit of an oxymoron if you look at the epistemic vocabularies, which is why I call this lecture Epistemic Entanglements. Because look at Clark, situated. We should say, well, that's our terrain, humanities, social sciences. Situated self, situated citizen. That's what the hell is a scientist doing with that word? But it's exactly the point. He's not saying situated mind or situated self. Well, that's easy. We will quickly gobble it up, right? But situated brain. Now, brain is different. Brain is neurons, synapses, electrochemical reactions, synaptic firings, and all the rest of it. But that's exactly the point. He's saying even the most hardcore neural look at the brain must acknowledge its situatedness, right? Must acknowledge that even the way neurons fire information, even the way synapses fire information, will and must acknowledge the situatedness of it, right? And that, of course, allows us to make this really interesting connections between cognition at a computational level, hardcore neuroscience, and also what we now begin to call social neuroscience, where memory studies becomes this really interesting, expansive territory, as it were. But allow me to cut back in literature again, because that's what I do for a living. I teach literature, stories, right? Now, there's a very interesting connection to be made, and I think, which is why I think this project in particular is so fascinating. I'm a fan of everything Pramod does, but I think this has a special social significance, really, because IWE Online, you have this really interesting museum of a certain kind of literature in a digital framework. It's a digital museum. It's a moving museum, quite literally, right? It's a museum which moves with you in your smartphones, in your gadgets, wherever you are. So you don't go to the museum comes to you. So, which I think is a really radical and, if I may say so, revolutionary step in terms of chronicling the diachronic description of IWE to make it online, the digitality of it, right? So a project like this really allows us, it becomes a case study in my reading of memory. See, someday if I have the time, I might write a paper on this. I don't have the time. But it's a fascinating project because I think what it does, it talks about the museumization of political context, cultural context through literature. And if I remember, last time I was here, in a bigger room actually, the same building, I talked about how for the longest time we did not have a museum of partition, right? There was no physical museum of partition. And of course, there are complex political reasons behind it, how one cannot never really ignore the complicity of the new nation formation with the horrors of violence, etc. So all kinds of reasons for that, why there was no partition museum. But my contention was, for the longest time, literature was a museum. The stories, the novels, the poems, the short stories, those were the museums through which partition was remembered again and again, through which it was chronicled again and again. And like all good works of literature, if you read the works of Chris Van Saying or Manto or Baldwin, all the lovely writers we have in different parts of the world, really, what we find is, again, a very interesting intersectional way to look at memory, both as a moving, sentimental, affective architecture, in terms of how people felt, moved, emoted, wept, cried, etc., and also how the complex socio-cultural conditions would change dramatically, right? There's a dramatic defamiliarization, as it were, where your neighbors become strangers, where friendship, kinship turns to hostility, and so on and so forth. Now, I have two case studies for tomorrow. I promise not to bore you with that today. So I have two short stories, not from partition, but in different contexts. One is Jhumpa Lahiri's Temporary Matter, the second being Geeta Hariharan's The Remains of the Feast. So I'll come to the more sort of case study bit in literature tomorrow. But what I do today in the rest of the session is look at what Alan Palmer calls shading in literature. Now, Palmer is a really interesting philosopher, I think. He talks about what he calls shading. So what is shading in literature? Or fiction, for the matter. Now, if you look at fiction as a medium, and I might be boring you already with this, but I think it's important to emphasize when we talk about literature, it's a certain medium of language we're talking about. So the literary medium is a very special medium. It is not ordinary language. So there's a difference between, let's say, if I were to tell you, when I was walking down this road, I saw some nice flowers and I felt happy. That's one description. If I were to tell you instead, 10,000 saw at a glance, tossing their heads, sprightly dance, that's a different description. And you're more likely to remember the second version. Why? Because I'm defamiliarizing the language. Right? I'm turning it to something else. I'm rearranging the furniture, as it were, right, to make it more memorable in quality, which is why you'll find that you remember lines from poetry more often than you remember lines from a really good piece of journalism, right? You're less likely to remember that, but you're more likely to remember the opening lines of Pride and Prejudice or a Dickens novel or a Wordsworth poem and so on and so forth. And the reason is, cutting back to memory studies, the way memory works, there are three phases, really, if you look at the sequence of memory. The first being encoding, the second being consolidation, the third being retrieval, right? So encode information, you consolidate information, and depending on the strength of consolidation, you retrieve it. It becomes long-term memory or short-term memory, depending on how solidly you've consolidated it. Now, if you notice, each of these three phases, encoding, consolidation, retrieval, has a slippery quality to it. So not everything you see gets encoded, right? So there are bits that are not encoded. Not everything which gets encoded become consolidated. And of course, not everything consolidated are retrieved. So there is always a slipping away of things, of matter, in some sense, which is why when you look at encoding, you also have to look at it from a perspective of erasure. So every act of encoding is also already an act of erasure. You're erasing certain bits, you're encoding certain bits together. So what memory studies teaches us at a very epistemic level is pretty similar to what literature teaches us. The ability to accommodate and articulate ambivalence. Now, what is ambivalence? We sometimes tend to think of ambivalence as confusion. Of course, there's one Hamletian way to look at it. I'll come back to Hamlet. But if you look at it technically, etymologically, ambivalence is the possibility of multiple valencies. Ambi as in both, valence, if you remember your class 6 chemistry, valency. So both values can be simultaneously present and valid, right? So it's just the opposite of the binary logic of computer. It's just the opposite of algorithms in some sense, right? It's a different discourse. It's a different kind of encoding, right? And we sometimes joke in IIT when I hang out with computer scientists that, at the end of the day, we're doing very similar things. You're making a coded language, so are we. We're making a very coded language, which is why literature is a very cryptic language. It needs, when you talk about competent readers, you have to decode the language, which is why we keep hearing the phrase, read between the lines. What is not there? The red ink, the unavailable cream in the kitchen, and so on and so forth. Now, with ambivalence, the other important thing that memory also teaches us, and the first paradox being remembering and forgetting are connected categories. Before I forget, I must mention the second paradox, which is also some kind of a theorem, as it were. Every act of remembering is equally an act of retrospection and anticipation, right? This is interesting because we tend to think of remembering as only retrospection. You sort of go back in time. But of course, you go back in time to have the cognitive toolkit to move ahead in the future. So if I remember who I am, what my address is, what my phone number is, I will be able to figure out a way to go back to the guest house wherever Atul and other people have put me up very kindly today, right? I need to remember who I am. I need to remember my identity, which is the only way I can forge forward in time. I can move ahead in space and time. So as paradoxical as it may sound, there is a futuristic quality about memory. And everything I'm saying now is more or less relevant for both the dimensions of memory, both the micromolecular dimension as well as the macro cultural dimension. Let's come to the cultural dimension. So when I say, well, what cultures remember is not just retrospective, but also futuristic. There's a reason why you'll find across human history, at different points of time, diachronically speaking, suddenly certain myths, certain figures, certain events have become important, right? Not because politicians are very sentimental about the past. Well, of course not, right? But because that kind of past, that metonymic reconstruction of the past, gives them sort of toolkit to legitimize future action, to carry out a certain kind of policy. It can be military action, it can be discursive designs, it can be political, ideological actions. It has happened across human history, right? So remembering, suddenly bringing back certain bits from the past in a very selective way suddenly creates this economy of hygiene against which the unhygienic identities may be measured and calibrated and resented, right? So different kinds of identity politics can open up again. So again, you can see how collective memory can be manipulated, even weaponized, and it has happened throughout human history in many ways. We can cite many examples. Which is why when we look at nostalgia, it's a very, very complex thing, and it's also a very problematic thing, nostalgia, because of course nostalgia comes with a certain amount of agency. You need to have the agency to be nostalgic, which means you're looking back at the past because you have the agency to move on from that, right? And of course, as someone like Svetlana Boym would tell us, there is reflective nostalgia, but also restorative nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia is this very uncritical bringing back of the past for sentimental reasons. Of course, it's not innocent. Reflective nostalgia is also looking at the fault lines, right? Again, that's one phrase we have stolen from geography. We steal everything from everywhere: quantum physics, geography. We're very good at theft jobs, aren't we? But if you look at reflective nostalgia, as Boym defines it, it is also bringing back a certain kind of memory, but equally with the fault lines. It's looking at memory as land masses, right? Now, land masses, as you all know, sometimes seamlessly get together, but sometimes they don't. If you go to Iceland, for example, you find land masses are moving away, drifting away. There's this gap between land masses, right? Which is why fault line is such a handy metaphor in certain sense. So reflective nostalgia, according to Boym, would also open up questions about what is not remembered in nostalgia, what is forgotten, what is erased. And then, of course, that begs the question, why do certain things, figures, sites, events get forgotten across human history, even within identities, right? So, for example, one of the common things I keep talking about in memory studies is why does something like the Holocaust get remembered again and again? Of course, it should be one of the cruelest, most tragic atrocities that ever happened in human history, which killed so many people, such a barbaric, grotesque act of violence, which is commemorated not just politically, but also through popular entertainment, films, novels, and so on and so forth. Compared to that, why is someone like the Bengal famine, which even by Wikipedia estimates killed more people than the Holocaust, not remembered, right? Now, before we start blaming Churchill for it, of course we should also remember and ask ourselves a question, even within Bengal, right? Even within Bengal literature, why is it not remembered as heavily as it should be? Then, of course, that brings up all kinds of questions about elitism, metropolitan modernity, the different kinds of people who are doing the writing at that point of time, different identity politics. Of course, the people who died were people not worth remembering, and so on and so forth, which brings us the politics of the value in memory. Who is worth remembering? Which sacrifice is worth commemorating, right? So the entire valency of memory becomes interesting, which is why epistemic entanglements become a really interesting way to look at memory studies, because it brings in anthropology, neuroscience, the episodic quality of memory, the collective quality of memory, and so it brings it all together into this really complex alchemy through which remembering and forgetting, restoration and anticipation take place. Now, I promise I'll speak on Hamlet a little bit, and I will not forget it. Now, if you go back to Hamlet, again, one of these canonical texts, really everyone loves talking about. It's a very interesting text, as you all know, from the perspective of masculinity studies, and I think Atul remembers many years ago I spoke on Hamlet in HCU as well. I love bashing that character. I'm not going to do that now. Okay, but if you remember your Derrida, when Derrida talks about specters of Marx, the really interesting book that he has, where he says this whole notion of hauntology that he talks about, the haunted ontology, that ontological framework which is gone but not quite, right? Which sort of lingers as this residual liminal presence in the margin. Interestingly, the metaphor he uses is Hamlet's father, right? That political order which has been killed, decimated, but hasn't quite disappeared, right? It's still operating from a remote. And if you look at Hamlet, among other things, it's a really interesting take on Scandinavian politics. How this is a remote control operation happening from outside of Denmark, and Norway is about to attack, and the inside of Denmark is pretty much hollowed up. It becomes really interesting, but we'll not go there. But even from perspective of memory studies, we'll find that the spectrality of an old collective memory continues to haunt, continues to shape, continues to infect in many ways the contemporary memory, the contemporaneity of memory. So how the political momentum will go forward may be controlled remotely, may be controlled by a spectre, may be controlled from the half-forgotten, the phantom limb, as it were. Which brings me, and I arrive at phantom limb not accidentally, but things might look accidental, but it's all rehearsed actually. So the whole idea of phantom limb, as you all know, the neuroscientist who made it famous is from Chennai actually, V.S. Ramachandran. He's got his glorious works, really path-breaking work on phantom limbs. I mean, you all know what phantom limb is. That limb which is gone, that limb which is amputated away, but it still continues to make its presence felt through itch, most commonly through itch, is that limb, that cut arm, which still itches at some sense. Now, that metaphor of the phantom limb can be really used and connected to the Derridan metaphor of spectrality and hauntology, and this is why you see the usefulness of literature again coming in. That interplay of fabulation and fact, that interplay of imagination and articulation of reality, that interplay of restoration and anticipation. Now, I've spoken many times about anticipation without really explaining what is it doing in this session, so I must. So anticipation, as you all know, is that very interesting sense. Literature has this good old idea of open-endedness, as you all know. And of course, Professor Mukherjee was giving us fascinating examples of how that can have extreme extensions in video games, the sort of ludic narratives in video games which invite open-endedness, which sort of made an industry of open-endedness, as it were. But literature was there first, in some sense. In fact, I was thinking of all kinds of literary works that might connect to video games. Even something as early as Tristram Shandy, for example, by Lawrence Stern, where you have this dark pages because someone died in the previous page, where you have this page which is written and it's scratched off, but just enough for you to read what is behind the scratch. It has all kinds of ludic possibilities. And remember, this was written at the time of Robinson Crusoe. Pretty much the same thing, same time. Well, of course, Crusoe becomes what Professor Mukherjee calls white protagonism, and that becomes a more industrially viable narrative to be pushed forward and published. And Shandy, of course, becomes a more experimental work, which I think lends itself really interestingly to video games today. And it sort of comes back in a very interesting way. But anticipation, even the most boring classic realist novels. Let's look at Robinson Crusoe, for example. Easily one of the most boring novels ever written, right? There's a sigh. We mentioned Robinson Crusoe, as it indeed should be. But we also have to remember, credit where it's due, therefore deliberately makes it boring. It's a very deliberately boring novel. Because, it's also a novel where the Christian is also trying to make a lot of money, but doesn't quite know the vocabulary to fuse in the more sort of the ethics of Christianity with the guiltlessness of making a lot of money, which is why you find that the bookkeeping vocabulary of Robinson Crusoe is still so Christian. He has this, one page of good things and bad things, and he wants to make it sound like a very Protestant kind of a thing, right? So it's a very confused vocabulary in many ways, because it's a newly emerging capitalist who still wants a moral backbone to keep doing what he is doing. So the confusion of the vocabulary of Robinson Crusoe is very deliberately designed in some way. So in some sense, it's an old moral memory meeting the new possibilities of capital, right? So how do you reconcile the two? Which is why there are pages and pages of dense description of good things and bad things, of bookkeeping in terms of how I lost a gun, so God must be punishing me. It almost gets comical in some points, but it is very much a white protagonist novel in some sense. Now, Robinson Crusoe is not the first name which comes to mind when we talk about experimental memory work, right? It's not. There are much better examples. We can think of Art Spiegelman, Joseph Conrad, Salman Rushdie, but I'm going to stick to Crusoe for a reason. Right. He hate me for this. But I will try to convince you that it's actually quite cool if you think about it in some sense, because look at what happens in Robinson Crusoe. The entire novel is a flashback novel, by the way, right? If you remember your Robinson Crusoe, the guy got shipwrecked many years ago, right? His ship sank many years ago, but he still remembers a number of nails he stole from the ship. And the ship is fascinating. It sinks only after he's stolen everything from it. Guns, nails, biscuits, whiskey, rum, all the goodies he gets in the ship sinks right after that moment. Okay. But there are pages and pages of dense, boring descriptions where Crusoe is telling us how he's building a fence, how he's making a plantation, how he's worried about attack, and so on and so forth. Right? So you all know that. You all suffered it at some point in your lives, that boredom in Robinson Crusoe. But what some of you may have missed towards the end is that half sentence where Crusoe says, by the way, I came back to England, I got married, my wife produced 3 sons, and then she died. Right? The wife occupies a half sentence in Robinson Crusoe. The nails occupy 2 pages in Robinson Crusoe. Right? Now, there's a politics behind it. Of course, it's funny. We should all laugh at it. But this tells us something about the zeitgeist of the time, the momentum of the time. Where is the priority of memory is? Which is a privileged memory? What is worth remembering in some sense? The nails are obviously much more valuable than the wife. Right? The only purpose of the wife is to produce more Robinson Crusoes, more men who can carry on the legacy story forever. And look at how the legacy narrative meets in a sort of metafictional way towards the end, where he says, well, by the way, I went out again, had another adventure, made a lot of money, but if you want to read it, buy the next book. Right? Because a book is the next commodity. It's a very metafictional thing. It's talking about making money, but the only way to make money for Defo is a book about making money. So the book is very much nested within a narrative of money-making and capitalism and legacy formation, right? And you know it's not an accident that right down to Dickens, we have this idea of serializing stories, right? So let that continue on and on and on, right? So that's the way to fight against time and so on and so forth. I mean, we can go back to Shakespeare and think of that moral dilemma. What's going to happen after I die? Oh, let me write a few sonnets so that people can keep reading it, remembering it. But with print media, it becomes tangible. You have a book you can hold, right? Print gives you the fleshiness of memory. You can hold on to a book, give it to someone else. It enters circulation. It enters production and consumption. It can be multiplied many times. In other words, the story will not die anymore, right? So with the arrival of the print, we have, at a very meta market level, one of the first times in human history where stories can continue to live forever, right? Now, that's a bit different from oral narratives. The oral narratives, of course, is an intergenerational thing, and someone was asking me about that, and I will talk about that. But let me stick to print a little bit at the moment, because for the first time in human history, we have stories materializing. We have stories which are worth commemorating, because they're worth producing and selling, and we can make multiple copies of the story. And of course, then translation comes in, stories can travel across borders, stories can travel across all kinds of things. The novel, of course, it's not an accident that the rise of a novel and the rise of the merchant class happen almost simultaneously, right? So that's a story about the merchant class, for the merchant class, and sometimes written by the merchant class as well, right? So that becomes very much part of the market capitalism through which memory formation begins to take place. There's a lot of interesting work about memory and materiality. Now, we could just go on forever, but one wonderful person to read about this is Andrew Hoskins. Hoskins has been a collaborator with us at CMS IIT Madras, but he works on that sort of the cusp of change between print and digitality. So what happens to memory when the deathless digital arrives, right, where nothing really dies in a digital, right? So what happens to memory? What happens to the ontology, the function, and the economy of memory, right, when the deathless digital arrive, which is why I think this particular project is so fascinating. IWE Online. It is that museum, the meta museum of memory, which can keep absorbing more and more content, which is plastic in so many ways. And of course, we can talk about plasticity later. It can keep, moving forward in time, and in some sense, it might never die. So, in that sense, this is the material of memory which transcends materiality. Right? So it becomes some kind of a hyper memory in that sense. And of course, I'm using the word hyper memory in connection to the hyperlink economy, where one link connects to another link, and you can keep moving across in potentially endless way to find out, navigate knowledge, and so on and so forth. But allow me to wind up now with two more concepts that I think are really interesting in terms of epistemic entanglements. So we talked about the psychology of memory, the culture studies bit about memory, hopefully the semiotics of memory as well, in terms of how memory acquires different forms of materiality, different forms of time, and how different forms of materiality correspond to different functions of remembering. So there's a difference between, let's say, pre-digital memory worked and post-digital memory worked. So I'll give you one quick example, my example, because I think I belong to that generation, at least in Calcutta. Things may be more advanced in Hyderabad, but at least in Calcutta, the sort of late 90s, when we literally saw the internet come, like literally saw the internet come. And internet back in the day was something very different. Internet meant taking an auto rickshaw and going to a very shady parlor and paying 20 rupees and looking at ridiculous stuff and then coming back home again. So internet was outside the home. Internet was the uncanny, the unhomely, that which is outside the home. And of course, what happened increasingly is a domestication of the internet. The internet entered the home, became a massive computer that looked like an elephant in the room, literally. And then it got more and more miniaturized. And now it's a smartphone, it's a nail, it's a fingernail, it's your ear, it's part of your body, really. So that massive industrialization of miniaturization that has happened with the internet has, of course, had profound influence in terms of how memory functions work. To give you one quick example, in the 90s, of course, I'm ancient, I had to remember at least 24 numbers because I had to, right? And those are landline numbers, all kinds of phone numbers I had to remember because there's no other way I could have remembered it. The only phone number I remember now is my wife's because there are machines remembering for me, right? There's sort of these, even non-material things will remind me, social media, other things will remind me of anniversaries and birthdays and different kinds of, worth commemorating events. In other words, we have this virtual vocabulary of memory, literally and symbolically virtual vocabulary of memory connected to the virtual economy of memory. And that economy of memory is an industrial economy. So look at just to give you one more example of how memory devices have changed. So the floppy disk came and died too quickly. A bigger dinosaur came and ate it up. The CD-ROM, right? The CD-ROM lasted for a little bit longer than a floppy disk. And then, of course, memory stick came into being. Now we don't need a device anymore. We can upload things in cloud. We have become quite literally immaterial, right? Or hypermaterial. So this sort of transcendence of materiality which has happened, where the material has disappeared. We have this idea of multi-materiality, which is one of the articles you published as well. Multi-materiality, which is obviously connected to the politics of visibility and invisibility, right? So the more sophisticated the materiality, the less visible it is, because it's connected to this endless economy of memory. That having said, let's come back to literature. Let's come back to the relevance of literature. So you might be thinking, well, why would I read literature at all in such time and place? So the role of literature in an age of artificial intelligence, in other words, which is the book title that I have in mind, which I may never write. But the idea of literature and storytelling, and going back to oral narratives, going back to the unwritten word, going back to that word which moves in time and space, the good old idea of storytelling. And a good philosopher to look at, someone I was very lucky to meet, albeit briefly, is someone called David Herman. Now, David Herman has got this brilliant book called Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, right? Again, notice how it's sort of doing what I am doing in a more superficial way today, which is epistemic entanglement, right? Storytelling, which is the sort of folklore, folk tradition, folk psychology, cultural studies, sociology, and all the rest of it, and sciences of the mind, the hardcore neural bit, right? The neural cognition bit about cognition and the social bit about cognition. How do you mix the two, right? Is this a happy marriage, right? Is this harmonious? And Herman argues it is actually, because at some level, we have always been tool makers, right? Homo faber, as some philosopher would call us. We've always built tools to do things for us, right? So of course, it's diachronically evolved. We have become more sophisticated. We have AI today. We had wheels many millions of years ago. But there's always this tendency to prosthetize human emotion, to push it outside the body in some sense, right? So, with the idea of the tool maker, the homo faber quality, now what I argue is this homo faber, or the tool maker, is also the storyteller, the homo fabulous in some way. It doesn't exist, that word. Please don't cite me. I just made it up, right? So the fable maker, right? So the tool maker and the fable maker have evolved in a very synchronous way. So we've learned to tell stories to each other. We have been a storytelling animal, as Saman Rishi tells us in Joseph Anton, and equally, we have been tool-making animals, right? So there's a very interesting connection to be made at an evolutionary level between telling stories and making tools, right? So let's not get too ahead of ourselves today and say, well, in an age of AI, stories will end. Well, that's absolutely untrue. We have statistical records which completely show the opposite, right? Book sales are still very high. And see, every age will have its unique panic, right? I mean, Darwinism created its own panic. We have AI to create our own panic. But if you go by empirical records, novels still sell in great numbers. Kindles did not come and kill books away. Books are still bought and read. There are still queues before bookshops where celebrity writers come and sign books, right? So the whole idea of the tool maker and the storyteller should be studied, and Herman does it to a certain extent in that book in a very evolutionary kind of way. Which brings me to the conclusion of my session. Slightly untypical, but I hope it will make sense. I connect literature, or the need to sort of keep consuming, producing literature, with a sort of evolutionary function in the human brain. And I'm probably being a little bit cheeky, but I have some evidence for this as well. And remember, at the beginning of this session, I used the word chunking, right? People are nodding, so there's some memorability of all this. Good. That's good to know. But chunking, as you all know, is the brain's idea of chunking out information to keep what is important, to sort of, the brain is a biased machine. It's a notoriously biased machine. And the brain is also an interpretative machine. We are hardwired to interpret. We're hardwired to filter. We're hardwired to bias. It's just the way we are made, for good or bad, right? And so chunking is a word which is used in neuroscience, especially by someone called Joseph Ledoux. I'm going to mention Ledoux in a different context in a minute. Ledoux, Ledoux. So Ledoux has this sort of theory of chunking, and also this really interesting theory of reconsolidation. Now, what is reconsolidation? That's one model of memory. According to the reconsolidation model of memory, every time you remember something, the brain, you're not remembering the original event. What do you remember? The last remembered version. You remember the last remembered version, and then you make a new memory, and the version changes. So there's a slipperiness, almost textual quality, as it were. But, of course, as you can now begin to imagine, it is profoundly manipulatable. You don't have to watch a science fiction film. You don't have to watch Blade Runner. It happens in your brain. That's the bad news and good news, right? Memory is very, very manipulated. It doesn't require an artificial chip, right? It doesn't require any of the Ridley Scott scenarios. It is just an organic neural thing. It's just a neural toolkit. So there's this reconsolidation thing about memory. But chunking, so the brain chunks in, chunks out information, which is why the version you're telling me today about 30th September contains the time you got up, how was your coffee, when you came, who you met, and what did you attend. You've chunked out 70% already, even today. You've forgotten, right? You must, right? Interestingly, and this is one of those very rare eureka moments in research and literature, because we don't deal with chemicals, we deal with ideas. But sometimes ideas meet, and sometimes the same words meet, right? Herman uses the same word, chunking, David Herman, right? What does he say? And I so hope, I have my fingers crossed, I so hope Herman and Ledoux never met each other, because that will completely undercut my originality. If they met and decided to use the same word, that's just going to kill my research. I hope they never met, right? Let's assume they never met. Now, Herman, who is working on this sort of cognition, social psychology, the evolution of cultures, folk psychology, uses the exact same word, chunking. What does it mean? It means even cultures chunk in, chunk out information, which is why every culture will have its unique moral valencies. Every culture will have its unique good guys and bad guys. They will look uniquely in certain ways, certain anatomical, certain physiognomic ways, because those correspond to the unique social situatedness. Remember Andy Clark, the situated brain? The situatedness of that culture, right? So chunking is how fables are created, folk stories are created, ghost stories are created. You're constantly encoding information either through figures of ghosts or fairies or fables and all the rest of it. But it's chunking, right? So chunking happens at a collective level, chunking happens at a neural level, which allows us to come back to, guess what? Literature, right? That one instrument which got there first. That one instrument which I argue is perhaps the earliest gig humans had with augmented reality. What is literature if it's not augmented reality? What is literature if not a VR set? When you read a novel, what do? You're weeping and rooting and hating characters that don't exist. You're constructing landscapes which don't exist, right? You get so worked up, you burn books, you want to kill the author, knowing fully well he's writing about stuff which don't exist, right? So literature, in my argument, is a first AR VR headset, right? Which continues to serve even today, perhaps even more today than it did when Defoe was writing Robinson Crusoe. I will end now with another note to Ledoux, with interesting take on something that you don't normally expect to talk about in memory studies and literature, but it is important, and that is the role of anxiety, right? Anxiety. What is anxiety? Anxiety is a bad thing. Anxiety connects to all kinds of mental health issues. We are aware of it. It's a deeply sensitive subject. We're not looking at anxiety from a clinical perspective. What we're doing instead is looking at anxiety from an evolutionary perspective. Here we go back to Ledoux again, and I do recommend this wonderful book he has called Anxious. It's a beautiful book. You should all read it. It's called Anxious. Now, Ledoux is a famous neuroscientist who works on something called amygdala, which is a fear thing in the brain. I'm not going to go there. Hippocampus, amygdala, boring stuff. But he talks about anxiety from a cultural perspective. So we are very, very anxious today. Modernity is full of anxiety, and so on and so forth. But here's the interesting thing. He says, well, anxiety in some sense is obviously terrible, but it is part of the cognitive toolkit. How so? Why are people anxious? Why is the human brain anxious? And he says, well, in a very interesting sense, just like we are the only storytelling animals, we are the only anxious animals. It's not fear, by the way. That's very different. Fear is viscerality. You're producing fear. So the William James kind of thing that James says this really weird thing about a bear. He says, you are not running because you are afraid. You are afraid because you're running. You know, it just reverses the whole thing. Well, it's very, very weird. Anyway, we'll not go there. William James, brother of Henry James, stream of consciousness, that American guy. Anxiety, Ledoux, right? Now, Ledoux says, well, we are uniquely anxious, and in the same sense, we're uniquely storytelling, we're uniquely makers of tools. Why? Because if we look at each of these strengths, anxiety, storytelling, tool making, what is it about? It's about projecting ideas into the future, right? What is a story? Why are you making up stories? Because you want to project certain ideas in the future, out in the vacuum, out in the ether. What is a tool? You're projecting something out of the body, something which will make you move better, feel better, and so on and so forth. So prosthetic stuff has been since the beginning, since we are cavemen, right? So no need to pat ourselves on the back too much today. We are just dealing with a new tool in the market, that's it. But that has been part of the toolkit from the beginning of time. We just had different things at different points. Anxiety tool, in a very interesting sense, is a projective mechanism. You're projecting scenarios. Now, why is it such a big deal? Why is it something that should be seen as an ability? Now, I'm doing two strange things over here. I'm looking at forgetting as an ability. I'm also looking at anxiety as an ability, right? But I hope you'll stay with me on this. I've got Ledoux to back me up, famous neuroscientist, so I'm in good hands. Ledoux says, you're only anxious because you're projecting and creating multiple scenarios in your head connected to ambivalence, and you're trying to figure out which one works and which one doesn't work. And you're getting a neural feedback, which is making you anxious because you're running scenarios ahead. You're projecting anticipatory scenarios, right? So in that sense, it is deeply connected to cognition. It is functionally connected to storytelling, tool making, and the rest of it. And he has this beautiful quote with which I will end. And I think it's sort of the kind of quotation where neuroscience meets literature, meets empathy, meets social cognition. And it goes a bit like this, where he says that anxiety is the price that a human brain has had to pay for its ability to anticipate the future, right? I'll say it one more time. It's a price that the human brain has had to pay for its ability to anticipate the future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parui, for that terrific talk and for bringing back memories of several previous talks and lectures and so on. So the audience, I'm sure, has questions.
Hello. Thank you, sir, for that wonderful lecture. I was interested in one particular aspect of your talk. You were talking about, how this memory has this move to materiality. So different material conditions that arises from a certain kind of memory making process. So I was thinking in that regard, doesn't it also happen that memory sometimes moves in the reverse direction also? Through the non-presence or of a past, like how we say I was thinking, for example, how Pamuk writes his book Istanbul, right? So he's going back to the city and trying to trace the city and where he lives, the windows, the like houses, and at some point you realize that the narrative is not really authentic there. At some point he might be making up things, right? So, and in connection with this further, so then how do we sometimes explain melancholic states of the mind, right? Where you are not really, you don't really know why you are sad, but you are kind of trying to go back to a non-present past. Okay, so I was just thinking if there is, especially in the case of literature also, how do you find that reverse movement of memory too?
Yeah, it's brilliant, and no wonder you're working on Philip Larkin, because you bring in memory, melancholia. It's exactly, you got the perfect poet. He's my favorite poet as well, by the way. But you're quite right, and Pamuk is a very interesting case in point, because I'm sure you know that the kind of nostalgic representations of Istanbul that he has produced, it has had very complex reactions within Turkey. Now, there's a lot of politics around Pamuk. He's seen as someone who's exoticized Turkey for a very Western audience. And inside Turkey, his reception is very, very complex, very complicated, right? So there's a definite degree of manipulation. And I suppose every actor memory is a manipulation, right? Because we are hardwired to be biased. So in that sense, it's part of the ontological toolkit. If you remember, you manipulate. It's just no other way, right? Which is why you find when Professor Mukherjee was talking about facial recognition softwares, you find how deeply racialized those things are. There are so many case studies, even police case studies, where identifying, non-Caucasian faces has been a big problem because the software is created and fed by Caucasian faces. So even at the level of the sort of prostheticization of recognition, we have that sort of bias creeping in. So I think the whole idea of manipulatable memory is a bit of a given in memory studies. Everyone knows that. Now, the bigger question is, I think this is the question you're asking so brilliantly, that, is it then fair to say, well, just because there is no objective memory, well, everything goes? Of course not, right? Now, this is where I think the ambivalence bits comes in. Just like we are not looking at remembering and forgetting as necessary ontological opposites, equally, we're not looking at the subjective and the objective as opposites. The objective is always already subjective. But here's the interesting bit, and the ethical bit. The subjective is also already objective, right? So they don't really undercut each other. Because every actor's subjectivity, I mentioned stream of consciousness, even the most escapist consciousness narrative, is situated in a very, very regressive Catholic Dublin. And that will be the vocabulary. So there's a difference between how Daedalus has a stream of consciousness and how a Larkin novel speaker will have a stream of consciousness in a post-1960 England, right? They're very different because the materiality is different, the factories are different, the cars are different, the entire ecology is different. And, we published a little bit on memory ecology as well, when really have a very inclusive idea of ecology. It's not just about man versus nature, but also machines, abundant projects, abundant buildings, cars, vehicles, and all the rest of it. So the memory ecology will profoundly influence even the neural interiority of memory, right? And which is why Andy Clark is so useful for us. So you're quite right. So there is this manipulatable quality of memory, but that doesn't mean that we just disregard it as a false memory, right? right? So, and I'm sure you know that even every act of autobiography, in a certain sense, is a political act, because obviously you're foregrounding certain bits, you're not foregrounding certain bits. And Rollerball has this very cheeky autobiography where he says, Rollerball by Rollerball. That's the name of the autobiography. And the first line is, everything should be read as a line of a novel or something. So he's deliberately making it very fabulatory in quality. So that's that. Now, melancholia is very interesting because it allows me a little bit to go the clinical side of memory, not too much, hopefully, not to bore you. But if you read someone like Antonio Damasio, right, who's fascinating, again, like Ledoux, he's written books. He's a very famous neuroscientist who works on this interface of emotion and cognition, where he talks about how every act of cognition is also emotional cognition. And he's fascinating because he, in a very interesting sense, he takes on Descartes. He has this book called Descartes' Error, where he talks about how this Cartesian dualism of the mind-body is flawed because, there's nothing called mind recognition and body recognition. Every cognition is an embodied phenomenon in that sense. So instead of a top-down model of cognition, we have a distributive, or instead of a hierarchical model, we have a heterarchical model of cognition, where it's sort of spread out and all the rest of it. But Damasio also writes on melancholia, right? And it's interesting how he defines melancholia using a very philosophical language, like Ledoux. And he says that apparently, and I'm quoting Damasio here, that we are hardwired. Every brain is hardwired to value itself, right? We must value us. That's where you're born. When the moment you're born, the brain is hardwired to value what it is, really. So melancholia is that very rare moment when the brain begins to devalue itself, right? And of course, that can quickly connect to all kinds of existential situations like nihilism, like the sense of self-abnegation, the Freudian sense of melancholia, and of course, it can have extreme psychological situations, sometimes very tragic situations as well. But it's a bit of a cognitive closure, as it were. That's the scientific way to look at it, where the brain is not doing something it's hardwired to do, right? And if you allow me, I'll use another philosopher that Damasio uses extensively and is written on him as well, Spinoza, right? And I'm sure some of you read Spinoza over here. So Spinoza, back in the time of Descartes, was offering an alternate enlightenment logic. So instead of the Cartesian dualism, Spinoza was offering monism. It's like this body is the mind is the body. There's no point where the mind ends and the body begins. Because I'm sure you'll agree that the Cartesian dualism very quickly lends itself to other kinds of problematic dualisms. So man versus woman, nature versus culture, white versus non-white. So the entire industry of dualisms generates from that Cartesian point in a certain sense, which is why enlightenment is sometimes seen as so collusive with imperialism, right, in an epistemic way. But Spinoza has this really fascinating term called conatus, C-O-N-A-T-U-S. Right? In my precocious days, I wrote a poem called Conatus. Please don't read it. I hope it's not available anywhere in Google. But conatus, right? Now, conatus, again, is exactly what Damasio talks about, that innate drive of the brain to value itself, right? That is why that's the part of the neural toolkit, that we must value ourselves. Melancholia is going against that drive in a certain sense, which is why it can lead to some extreme situations of tragedy. And in that sense, it connects very interestingly with memory, because it becomes a bit of a cognitive closure, melancholia, where the brain has stopped valuing itself and the body doesn't quite know what to do. And that can sometimes lend itself to really interesting situations. But, I must have a conversation with you. I think I'm really irritating you now, but I love someone working with Larkin, because I think he's such an under-researched poet, Philip Larkin. Because there's so much melancholia in that poetry, which can be read from a masculinity studies perspective, the failing memory perspective, but also the neural determinism perspective. Now think of something like "This be the verse," which I cannot say because it has an F word and it's been recorded, right? But it is pretty much that whatever you have is something your father and mother gave you. You must live with it. So what's the solution? Get out as early as you can and do not have any kids yourself. It's classic neural determinism. You are doomed because of your neurons, right? So I think it's fascinating. Thank you for your question.
Sir, you said that memory is evolutionary and it evolved with human evolution. Is it related to generational memory, and how generational memory is different different from collective unconscious?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you so much. So there's a memory theorist called Mariana Hirsch, Hirsch, who has this really interesting concept of post memory. Now, what is post memory? Post memory is a memory of a generation which did not live that memory, but which was handed down that memory. Right? Now that becomes very political because a lot of research shows that post memory generations find it more difficult to forgive. And they're more likely to be racist, they're more likely to be hostile, they're more likely because at some level, living through that memory can open up the liminal zones, which can allow forgetting, forgiving, all these things later on. Post memory is something handed down to a generation. This is what happened. You just consume it. They haven't lived through it. So that has more of a dogmatic quality to it. And that can become more weaponized in many ways, which is why you find that second generation survivors or third generation survivors sometimes are more hostile to what happened to the grandfathers than the grandfathers, who have a more liminal take on what happened because they lived through it. So the experientiality of memory generates liminality, generates forgiving, generates forgetting. But post memory has a sort of textual quality which is handed down and is given to you as a commodity almost, right? And because you inherit it as some kind of a hand me down thing, so it becomes a very interesting way to look at intergenerational memory. But while I'm saying it, the opposite is also true. Because if you read something like Milan Kundera, right? The Kundera has this brilliant book called the Book of Laughter and Forgetting. Again, I recommend it so heavily. I can't recommend it enough, actually. So Kundera offers something opposite to post-memory. He said one of the ways in which generations cope with trauma is they stop the memory from flowing to the next generation. It's a bit like bad blood getting stopped. So if you get infected by something, what do? You tie it up and don't let it spread. So that also becomes some kind of a medical situation where an entire generation stops talking about something, just so the next generation gets saved, gets protected from that traumatic memory. Right? So the opposite of post-memory also happens. And if you look at Kundera's work, he talks about post-communist Czechoslovakia, where certain communities stopped talking about the atrocities of the earlier political era just to protect the next generation from that memory. So that, to use Spivak, that aporeatic quality about memory, that point where memory doesn't get passed on, deliberately stopped, that also happens in an intergenerational way. So it's a very complex way to look at the economy of memory. It also gets passed on like a commodity sometimes, which can be weaponized subsequently. It can also be stopped and interrupted, almost with an act of violence, to protect next generations from that contamination of memory, as it were. So yeah.
Any more questions, comments? Actually, if I may add something, I was really interested when you mentioned that there is hardly any mention of Crusoe's wife in the whole novel. 100 years before Crusoe, you had Shakespeare writing his will in 1616. And I'm currently reading Greenblatt's Will in the World. So where he mentions Shakespeare's will, where he's bequeathed absolutely nothing to his wife. And it's apparently when he's probably told by his eldest daughter or someone that there is some sort of an addendum to that will where he bequeaths his second best, that well-known second best bed to his wife. It is almost like an afterthought. And you mentioned something like what is not mentioned, what is not referred to is also a part of, it also signals what we choose to remember or not to remember. And what Greenblatt does is he, in one sense, uses this particular instance in Shakespeare's life to make a larger comment on the missing wives in Shakespeare, in Shakespeare's oeuvre, so to say, in his larger bibliography, so to say. I mean, there are so many, in The Tempest, for example, you hardly meet Prospero's wife. You just hear that she's passed away before. And, or for that matter, perhaps the most powerful wife in all of Shakespeare, Lady Macbeth, she's a woman without a first name, and very conveniently bumped off in the beginning of the fifth act.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I mean, this is not so much a question, but a comment to, I mean, when you mentioned Crusoe's wife, it was something that struck me. So it was really interesting.
Yeah.
How absences matter.
Absolutely. I mean, again, you just triggered this, but I will go to Hamlet now and bore you again. I mean, look at how conveniently Hamlet kills off so many women, including Ophelia. I mean, Ophelia is abused and then dumped. And then, of course, right after she dies, that gives Hamlet one more scene to play the melancholy man, right? and then he can compete with the brother of Ophelia and outman him in his grief. So the entire purpose of the woman in Hamlet is to just keep furnishing Hamlet's magnetism, in magnetic masculinity in that sort of dramatic theatrical fashion. So you're quite right. I think the Renaissance is such a complex time where it is so deeply gendered, and ironically, that is also the time of illumination, was actually it's so dark in so many ways. I mean, we're not even going to the racial bit, but even within the European English bit, it is so class conscious, it's so hierarchical, and the gender thing is just abusive, even by any standard of imagination. So yeah, absolutely.